You know him as the king with 6 wives. But did you know he was also a master con artist? By the time he died, Henry VIII had scammed his own citizens, bankrupted a kingdom, and became so heavy he had to be moved around his palace with a pulley system. This is not the version of history you were taught in school. This is the story of a man who looked his people in the eye, made a promise, and then secretly stole the very wealth out of their pockets. It is the tale of how a golden prince became a common criminal to save his own throne. To understand how a king becomes a counterfeiter, you have to understand the world of 1540. England was a land of ceremony and stone, but its heart was made of silver. In this era, money was not just a piece of paper or a digital number on a screen. Money was the metal itself. A silver groat or a gold sovereign was valuable because it was heavy. It was real. If you took a coin to a merchant, he didn't just look at the face on it, he felt the weight of it. The king's image on that coin was the ultimate guarantee. It was a royal word that the silver was pure and the weight was honest. To touch a coin was to touch the honor of the king. But Henry VIII was a man who lived far beyond his means. He was a king who wanted everything. He wanted to be the most feared warrior in Europe. He wanted the tallest ships in the sea. He wanted palaces that would make the kings of France and Spain weep with envy. He built the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a party so massive it featured fountains flowing with wine, and a temporary palace made of glass. It was a display of wealth that the world had never seen before. But there was a dark secret behind the gold. Henry didn't actually have the money to pay for it. By the middle of his reign, the royal treasury was a cold, empty vault. Henry had inherited a fortune from his father, but he had burned through it in a decade of war and luxury. He had already tried the usual tricks. He had taxed the people until they were ready to revolt. He had even broken away from the church in Rome and seized the gold from the monasteries. He stripped the silver from the altars and the lead from the roofs. For a moment, he was rich again. But a man with Henry's appetite can spend a fortune faster than he can steal one. By 1540, the church gold was gone. The taxes were dried up, and the king was desperate. When a man like Henry becomes desperate, he does not look for a way to save. He looks for a way to cheat. He called his secret advisors to the Royal Mint, located deep within the dark towers of London. He told them he had a plan to create wealth out of nothing. It was a plan that would come to be known as the Great Debasement. It was the largest financial scam in British history, and it started in the heat of a furnace. The king ordered his men to gather the honest, heavy silver coins from the public. Under the cover of night, the fires were lit. The pure silver was melted into a glowing, bubbling liquid. But as the metal cooked, the king's men did something that would change history. They threw in handfuls of cheap, red copper. They mixed the precious silver with the worthless base metal. They stirred the pot until the two became one. From this weak, dirty mixture, they stamped new coins. When these coins came out of the press, they looked perfect. They were bright, shiny, and bore the proud face of King Henry VIII. But it was a hollow lie. Each coin contained only a fraction of the silver it was supposed to have. Henry took this fake money and used it to pay his massive debts. He paid his soldiers, his builders, and his wine merchants with coins that were secretly worth less than half of their face value. The king was suddenly rich. He had doubled his money simply by lying to his people. For a few years, The scam was a total success. Henry sat in his palace, watching his bank account grow. He bought more ships and built more walls. He believed he had discovered a magic trick that allowed him to spend money without losing it. The people went to the markets and traded the new coins for meat, bread, and beer. They trusted the king's face. They didn't realize that every time they accepted a coin, they were being robbed of their savings. It was a silent theft that moved from pocket to pocket across the entire kingdom. But truth is like water. It always finds a way out. You can hide copper under silver for a short time, but you cannot hide it from the friction of the real world. These coins were used every day. They were passed from the baker to the farmer. They were tucked into sweaty belts and rubbed against rough wool clothing. Because the king's portrait was stamped onto the coin in a specific way, his nose was the highest point of the image. It was the part of the coin that touched the world the most. Slowly, on millions of coins across the land, a strange and terrifying thing began to happen. The thin layer of silver on the king's face began to peel away. As the silver vanished, a bright, angry red copper started to show through right on the tip of the king's nose. It looked as if the king were blushing with shame. Across England, people began to look down at their money and see a red-nosed monarch staring back at them. The secret was out. The king was a fraud. The people weren't just angry, they were terrified. They realized that their money was dying. If the king's word was no good at the mint, it was no good anywhere. A joke began to spread through the taverns, a name that would stick to Henry like a curse for the rest of time. Old Copper-Nose. It was a name that mocked his greed and exposed his crime. But the laughter was bitter. The economy began to fall apart. Because the money was worth less, the prices of everything started to climb. Bread that once cost a penny now cost 3. Families who had saved for years found that their small piles of silver were now just piles of worthless copper. While the country struggled, the king himself was decaying. The golden prince of the past was gone, replaced by a man who was literally falling apart. Henry had become so massive that he could no longer walk. He had grown to over 400 pounds. His servants had to build complex systems of pulleys and ropes just to move him from his bed to his chair. He was trapped in a body that was as bloated and rotten as his treasury. He suffered from a horrific wound on his leg that never healed. The smell of his infected flesh was so powerful that people could smell the king before they could see him. He was a man who had tried to consume everything: food, women, gold, and power. But in the end, everything he touched turned to copper. He sat in his massive chair, surrounded by stolen things, listening to the reports of a kingdom in chaos. He had tried to outsmart the very laws of value, only to find that he had bankrupted the future of his own children. He had spent his honor to buy a few more years of luxury, and the price was his legacy. When Henry VIII finally died in 1547, he left behind a country that was broken. His son and daughters would spend decades trying to fix the disaster of the Great Debasement. They had to call in the copper coins and start the long, painful process of bringing honesty back to the English coin. It was a lesson that the world would never forget, that trust is the most valuable thing a leader can own, and once it is sold, it can almost never be bought back. We often remember Henry for his wives. We think of the 6 women and the tragic ends they met. We think of the great portraits of the man with the wide shoulders and the golden crown. But the real story of Henry VIII isn't found in the wedding chapel. It is found in the dirt and the dark corners of history. It is found in the pockets of the poor who held a coin and saw the red nose of a lying king. He was a man who wanted to be a legend, but he became a lesson. He thought he could buy immortality with fake silver, only to find that history eventually reveals the copper underneath. He started as a prince of light, but he died as the master of a shadow empire. In the end, a crown is just metal, and Henry's was made of copper. Henry VIII died in a palace filled with stolen gold, leaving his children to clean up a broken country. He wanted to be a legend, but to the people who lived through his reign, he was just a counterfeiter. He thought he could buy power with lies, only to find that history eventually reveals the copper underneath the silver. We remember the wives, but the coins tell the real story. He was a king who lost his honor one nose at a time. The silver always wears off, and the truth always shows through.